There is a type of power that almost no one values at the beginning of their journey. It doesn't make noise, doesn't immediately impress, and doesn't draw attention in environments dominated by loud voices and quick opinions. On the contrary, it is often mistaken for weakness, insecurity, or even a lack of assertiveness. But those who learn to master it discover something that completely changes how they live, decide, and position themselves in the world. That power is silence. We live in an era where everyone wants to speak, respond, give their opinion, react. There's a constant urgency to take a stand on everything, to have a ready answer, to show that you have a formed opinion on any subject. And in this fast-paced environment, silence seems uncomfortable. It seems strange. It even seems suspicious. But that's precisely why it becomes so powerful. Because while many speak impulsively, few observe before responding. While many react immediately, few reflect. And it is in this difference that a silent advantage is born. There's a very common scene that you may have experienced. Someone says something provocative. Someone tries to destabilize you. Someone makes an emotionally charged criticism. The atmosphere becomes tense. Everyone expects a response. There's almost an invisible pressure for you to say something, to defend yourself, to counterattack. And at that exact moment, there's a choice. React as expected, or remain silent. At first, choosing silence may seem uncomfortable. The ego wants to respond. The mind wants to prove a point. There's an almost automatic urge to justify oneself. But when you resist that impulse, something interesting happens. The energy of the situation changes. Because conflict needs two parties reacting to grow. When one of them remains centered, the entire dynamic transforms. Silence, when conscious, is not an absence of response. It is a strategic response. But it's important to understand that there's a huge difference between silence born of fear and silence born of dominance. The first is passivity. The second is control. Silence born of fear happens when someone doesn't speak because they fear judgment or rejection. Silence born of dominance, on the other hand, happens when someone has the full capacity to respond but chooses not to because they feel it's not worth the energy. And that difference changes everything. A trained mind understands that not every provocation deserves attention. Not every opinion deserves debate. Not every criticism needs to be fought. There is a level of emotional maturity that allows one to quickly assess, does this add something to my life? Does this build something? Does this deserve my energy? Most of the time, the answer is no. And when you start applying this filter, your life changes profoundly. Because much of the emotional strain people face comes from the constant need to respond to everything. Responding to messages immediately. Responding to criticism. Responding to comments. Responding to expectations. It's as if life were an endless sequence of stimuli demanding a reaction. And this constant reaction is exhausting. Conscious silence creates space, and space creates clarity. When you don't respond immediately, you gain time to think. When you don't react impulsively, you gain perspective. When you don't engage in unnecessary arguments, you conserve energy for what truly matters. There is immense strength in not explaining yourself to those who don't want to understand, in not arguing with those who only want to win, in not fueling conflicts that lead nowhere. This kind of silence is not weakness. It's emotional intelligence. But few people manage to practice it because it requires ego control. It requires enduring the discomfort of not having the last word. It requires tolerating the feeling that others might misinterpret your stance. And this is where many give up, because they prefer the immediate validation of the response to the lasting peace of silence. There is also something even deeper about silence. It reveals much more about others than about you. When you remain silent in the face of provocation, the other person often continues talking. And the more they talk, the more they reveal their own insecurities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. Silence acts as a powerful mirror. Meanwhile, you watch. Observation is an underestimated skill. In a world that values those who speak the loudest, few value those who understand best. But those who observe learn more, understand more, and make better decisions. And this creates an advantage that is not immediate, but is consistent over time. There is also a strategic aspect to silence. It prevents you from saying something you'll later need to fix. How many times have words spoken in the heat of the moment created consequences that could have been avoided? How many relationships have been damaged by impulsive responses? How many opportunities have been lost because someone didn't know how to wait? Silence protects you from yourself. It prevents momentary emotions from defining permanent decisions. It creates a barrier between impulse and action, and within that barrier, there is freedom. But perhaps the most interesting point is realizing that silence increases your value. People who talk too much become predictable. People who answer everything become too accessible. But those who know how to use silence create presence. They create mystery. They create impact. It's not about manipulation. It's about positioning. When you speak less, your words carry more weight. When you don't respond to everything, your response becomes more relevant. When you carefully choose when and how to position yourself, your communication gains strength. And this applies to all areas of life. Personal relationships, professional environment, social networks, family conflicts. Strategic silence changes dynamics. There is also an internal dimension to this: practice. External silence begins to create internal silence. And when the mind becomes less reactive, it becomes more stable. You begin to realize that you don't need to get emotionally involved in everything. That you don't need to absorb every comment, that you don't need to carry every opinion of others. This realization is liberating, because much of modern anxiety stems from the feeling that we need to respond to everything all the time. But when you learn that you can choose not to respond, something profoundly changes. A sense of emotional autonomy emerges. But be warned, silence doesn't mean never speaking. It doesn't mean remaining silent in the face of injustice or accepting constant disrespect. Strategic silence is not omission. It's a conscious choice. It's knowing exactly when to speak and when not to speak. And this distinction requires maturity, because there will be times when speaking is necessary, when taking a stand is important, when boundaries need to be established. And when you master silence, your speech in those moments becomes much stronger, because it's not impulsive speech. It's thoughtful speech, firm, clear. The problem is that most people never learn this difference. They either talk too much and lose impact, or they remain silent out of fear and accumulate frustration. The balance lies in the middle. And that balance is rare. Few choose silence because it demands inner security. Those who depend on constant validation feel the need to respond, to justify themselves, to explain themselves all the time. Those who have clarity about themselves, however, do not feel this urgency. There is a profound peace in knowing who you are and not having to convince anyone of it. And perhaps you've already experienced moments when you remained silent and later realized it was the best decision. That the situation resolved itself, that the conflict lost its power, that the provocation lost its meaning. Now imagine living like this more often. Imagine how many conflicts could be avoided, how much energy would be preserved, how many better decisions would be made. Silence is underestimated because its results are not immediate and noisy, but they are profound and lasting. And there's something even more powerful that happens when you master this skill. People begin to respect your presence differently, not because you speak louder, but because you speak with intention. Not because you react to everything, but because you carefully choose your battles. This posture creates natural authority. True authority is not imposed, it is perceived. But there's a difficult phase in this process. The phase where you start practicing silence and feel that others find it strange. That they expect a reaction that doesn't come. That they might try to provoke you even more to see if they can break your composure. It is precisely at this moment that your consistency will be tested. Because remaining silent requires more strength than reacting. Reacting is automatic. Silence is conscious. And the more you practice, the more you realize that silence is not empty. It is full of observation, analysis, and control. It is a powerful tool that few master. And that's just the first layer of this issue, because in the next part, we're going to delve into the deeper dimension of silence. The one that involves not only external conflicts, but internal dialogues. The one that transforms not only your communication with the world, but your relationship with yourself. But before we continue, let me ask you an important question. Do you usually respond immediately when provoked? Or have you noticed that, many times, silence would have been the best response? Keep this thought in mind, because what comes next can completely change how you approach every conversation, every conflict, and every decision. And when you begin to practice silence in the outside world, something unexpected begins to happen within you. At first, it seems like just a change in behavior, a strategic choice here and there. But over time, you realize it's not just about speaking less, it's about listening more. And above all, listening to something that for years has been muffled by the constant noise of automatic reactions, your own mind. Because there's a type of noise that almost no one notices. It's not the noise of social media, nor of arguments, nor of other people's opinions. It's internal noise, that continuous flow of thoughts, judgments, anticipations, and imaginary responses that happen all the time inside your head. Even when you're silent on the outside, you're often at war on the inside. And this is where the silence begins to become something much deeper. When you stop reacting immediately, you begin to notice what you're feeling before you act. You notice the anger rising. You notice the ego wanting to defend itself. You notice the fear of appearing weak. You notice the need for approval trying to infiltrate the decision. And this awareness changes everything. Because what was once automatic is now observed. And when something is observed consciously, it loses some of its power. There's a specific moment in this practice when you realize that the biggest conflict was never external. The arguments, the provocations, the criticisms, all of that was just a trigger. The real conflict was always internal. It was the need to be right, the need to be recognized, the need not to be disrespected, the need to be validated. Silence begins to reveal these layers. And that revelation can be uncomfortable, because it's much easier to blame the other person for your own reaction than to acknowledge that there's something within yourself that still needs work. But when you decide to be silent and observe what's happening internally, you begin to mature emotionally in a way that few people experience. You begin to realize that not all criticism is an attack, that not all disagreement is disrespect, that not all opposing opinions are a threat. Often, what you perceive as confrontation was simply your own insecurity being triggered, and this awareness brings freedom. Because when you understand your own vulnerabilities, you cease to be a hostage to them. Provocation loses its power because you understand what it's trying to trigger. Criticism loses impact because you've already internally assessed whether it makes sense or not. Conflict loses intensity because you no longer need to prove anything. Inner silence begins to create stability. And emotional stability is one of the rarest assets today. While many people react to every notification, every comment, every event, those who cultivate inner silence live with much greater clarity. Decisions become less impulsive. Words become more precise. Actions become more coherent. There is also something extremely powerful that arises from this practice: the ability to truly listen. When you're not busy preparing your response while the other person is speaking, you truly listen. And listening completely changes the dynamic of any conversation. Often, conflicts arise not because people disagree, but because they don't feel heard. Silence creates space for understanding. Understanding solves far more problems than argumentation. But there's an even deeper layer to all of this. Because when you silence the external world and begin to observe the internal world, you also begin to question your own patterns. You start to notice repetitive thoughts. You start to notice beliefs that perhaps no longer make sense. You start to identify fears that you've carried for years without realizing it. And that is transformative, because silence becomes a mirror. It shows you where you still react impulsively, where you still seek validation, where you still feel unnecessarily threatened. And when you see this honestly, you have the opportunity to change. But this phase is not comfortable, because facing one's own mind requires courage. It's much easier to get distracted than to observe. It's much easier to respond than to reflect. It's much easier to talk than to feel. And that is precisely why few choose to deepen the silence, because silence reveals. It reveals his weaknesses. It reveals his patterns. It reveals his fears. But it also reveals his strength, his capacity for self-control, his emotional maturity. And the more you practice, the more you realize that you don't need to have an opinion on everything. You don't need to participate in every discussion. You don't need to absorb every tension in the environment. You begin to better select what deserves your mental energy. This creates a gigantic change in the quality of your life, because mental energy is finite. And when you stop wasting it on unnecessary conflicts, you have room for creativity, planning, growth, and clarity. Your mind ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a space for construction. There is also a change in the way you see people. You begin to realize that many aggressive reactions stem from insecurity, that many criticisms come from frustration, that many attacks stem from unresolved pain. And when you understand this, silence ceases to be merely a strategy and becomes compassion. You stop reacting because you understand. And understanding is far more powerful than winning an argument. But be warned, this doesn't mean accepting constant disrespect or becoming passive. It means choosing when to act firmly and when to simply not feed into something that doesn't deserve your energy. There is a quiet strength in someone who doesn't need to shout to be respected. And the more you develop this strength, the more you realize that silence also strengthens your identity, because you are no longer reacting based on the environment. You are acting based on principles. This difference is fundamental. When your decisions stop being a reflection of what others do and start being a reflection of who you've chosen to be, your life enters a new level of consistency. And this consistency brings something extremely valuable: emotional predictability. Not in the sense of monotony, but in the sense of stability. You don't fluctuate as much. You're not easily swayed by fleeting emotions. You're not dragged down by empty arguments. There's a more solid inner center, and that changes everything. But there is a crucial point in this journey. A moment when you realize that silence is not just the absence of sound, but the presence of awareness. And when you reach that point, your communication changes forever. Because you only start speaking when you have something that truly adds value. And when you speak with intention. And that intention carries weight. In the next part, we'll delve into the climax of this transformation. The point where silence ceases to be merely a practice and becomes part of your identity. Where you realize you don't need to fight for space, you don't need to compete for attention, and you don't need to prove anything. But before we move on, reflect honestly. Is your silence today fear, or is it a conscious choice? Because the answer to that question defines the level of power you truly have over your own mind. And then you reach the point where silence ceases to be a technique and becomes part of who you are. It's no longer a conscious effort all the time, no longer a strategy you need to remember to apply. It becomes natural. You no longer feel the urgency to fill every space with words. You don't feel the need to react to every stimulus. You no longer feel that automatic impulse to prove something. And it is precisely here that the definitive turning point occurs. Because when silence becomes your identity, your presence changes. You enter spaces without needing to compete for attention. You participate in conversations without needing to master the subject. You listen more than you speak, observe more than you react, and think before you take a stand. And curiously, this makes your voice carry more weight when you finally decide to use it. There is something incredibly powerful about someone who doesn't talk all the time, but when they do, everyone listens. This doesn't happen by chance. It happens because silence has built authority. It filters out the unnecessary, eliminates impulse, and leaves only the essential. And the essential always has more impact. But the highest point of this journey isn't how others come to see you. It's how you come to see yourself. You begin to realize that you are no longer a hostage to provocations, that you are no longer dragged along by the opinions of others, that you are no longer dominated by momentary emotions. There is an inner space between what happens and what you decide to do. And within that space, there is freedom. Freedom to choose not to respond. Freedom to choose to speak only when necessary. Freedom to not have to explain yourself to those who don't want to understand. Freedom to preserve your peace without guilt. And that kind of freedom is rare, because most people still live reacting. They live trying to win arguments, trying to justify themselves, trying to convince, trying to defend themselves. And in this constant effort, they lose something essential: energy, clarity, and emotional stability. But when you master silence, you no longer engage in unnecessary disputes. You don't need to have the last word. You don't need to win every conversation. Because you understand something that few understand. Winning arguments is not winning in life. Silence teaches maturity. It teaches that some battles don't need to be fought. It teaches that some opinions don't need to be contested. It teaches that some people don't want to understand, they just want to react. And reacting to someone who wants to react is an endless cycle. You break this cycle when you choose conscious silence. But there is an even deeper layer to this climax. When you become someone who doesn't react impulsively, you begin to become someone who thinks strategically. Your decisions become more calculated, more consistent with your values. You start talking less, but acting more. And consistent, silent action is much more powerful than repetitive speeches. There's an almost invisible transformation happening here. You stop trying to appear strong and start being strong. Because real strength doesn't make noise. Real strength doesn't need a stage. Real strength remains, stable even when the environment tries to destabilize it. And perhaps the most striking moment of this journey is when someone tries to provoke you and simply fails. Not because you ignore them out of weakness, but because internally it no longer has power over you. This is true mastery. And mastery isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling yourself. Now think for a moment. How many times in the past have you reacted and then regretted it? How many times have words spoken in the heat of the moment created unnecessary consequences? How many times have you wasted energy trying to prove something to someone who is already determined not to understand? Now imagine how many of these situations could have been different if silence had been your response. Silence is not absence. It is a choice. It is a filter. It is maturity. But here's the most important point of all. Silence is not hiding. It's not accepting constant disrespect. It's not letting others cross your boundaries. Conscious silence exists until the moment when speaking becomes necessary. And when that moment arrives, your voice is firm, clear, and impossible to ignore. Because it doesn't come from impulse. It comes from awareness. It comes from control. And that difference is gigantic. When you speak after consciously observing, reflecting, and deciding, your words carry authority. And authority is not imposed, it is perceived. People can sense when someone is centered. They can sense when someone is not easily shaken. They can sense it when someone doesn't engage in any kind of emotional game. And this kind of presence completely changes how you are treated. But above all, it changes the way you live. Because living without reacting to everything brings a peace that cannot be bought. A lightness that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. A stability that doesn't waver with every opinion of others. And that peace begins within. It starts when you understand that you don't need to answer everything. You don't need to have an opinion on everything. That you don't need to prove anything all the time. It begins when you choose awareness instead of impulse. And here's the final point of this journey. Silence is a tool, but it's also a reflection of maturity. It shows that you no longer need to compete for space, you no longer need to vie for validation, you no longer need to react to feel strong. You simply are. And when you simply are, without a constant need to assert yourself, something changes forever. Now let me ask you something directly. Have you been using silence as a form of fear? Or as a form of power? Do you remain silent because you fear confrontation, or because you choose not to waste energy? Do you react automatically, or do you observe before acting? Write the word silence in the comments if you understand that this skill can transform your way of life. I want to know who has truly grasped the power of not reacting impulsively. If this content resonated with you, please leave a like. This helps this message reach more people who are still trapped by impulse and need to discover that there is another way to live, a more conscious, more strategic, and stronger way. And if you want to continue deepening your mind, strengthening your emotional intelligence, and learning to master your own reactions, subscribe to the channel now. Because this journey doesn't end here. It continues in every choice, in every conversation, and in every moment you decide to act consciously. Remember, the person who talks the loudest isn't always the strongest. Sometimes, the strongest person is the one who knows exactly when not to speak. And perhaps from today onwards your silence will cease to be absence and will become power.